Most of us have seen these guys, the largely silent but intensely aware Secret Service agents that surround US presidents, vice presidents, as well as a number of other important higher-ups. But the Secret Service didn't just always protect hierarchically privileged politicians. In fact, at their founding, protective missions weren't even within their scope at all. But a great American tragedy, a couple less than legal operations, and some good old-fashioned desperation would change that. This is the crime that created the Secret Service. Hey, I'm Chase, and welcome to Keep Curious Co. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the type of widespread crime that led to the creation of the Secret Service, their formation and their founding mission, and how they got to be the politician protectors that they are today. The United States Secret Service was formed in 1865 in response to a severe and ever-increasing threat facing the United States, one that had the potential to destroy the stability of the country and completely undermine the sovereignty of the United States government. You guessed it. Counterfeiting. By the end of the Civil War, the federal government realized it had a serious money-making problem. People were simply making too much of it, literally. An estimated 1/3 of currency in circulation in America was counterfeit, and it's worth mentioning that this is actually a modern conservative estimate. The New York Times printed an article in 1862 that had the estimate closer to 80%. Now, it's impossible to know for sure since people didn't have digital calculators, smartphones to run them on, or the internet to connect them to. But suffice it to say, it was enough to cause a serious problem. But how did America end up with such a massive counterfeiting problem? After all, it's not as though counterfeiting was just some new crime introduced to the world sometime in the 1700s and it seemed to catch fire in the Americas. Not even close. People have been counterfeiting money since money has existed, with some calling it the world's second oldest profession. It turns out that counterfeiting had been present in America since at least the 1680s, ramping up significantly through the late 18th and 19th centuries. To explain the rise of counterfeiting during this era, let's take a look at a couple of the major contributing factors. Starting in 1781, private banks began issuing their own paper banknotes. These banknotes were the only paper notes being issued in the United States up until 1861. As of 1862, there were 1,389 banks issuing multiple denominations of banknotes with an estimated 4,000 different variations that could be counterfeited and passed. Where the law-abidingly inclined saw a mishmash monetary system, criminals saw opportunity. Individuals and gangs sprung up across the country and started printing these counterfeit banknotes and selling them at a reduced cost. And with rising urbanization in America came more opportunities to swindle more banks at a higher volume than ever before. To craft these counterfeit notes, counterfeiters sought out and used discarded banknote plates. Some actually worked at the banks by day, printing additional counterfeit notes at night to sell on the side. But if you couldn't get your hands on a discarded banknote plate, there's actually an ingenious way to still, to this day, do this at home. All you need to do is grab be 20 minutes poorer, but $1,000 richer. And if these banks went completely under, which they tended to do, especially if their banknotes were being counterfeited into oblivion, these banknotes became completely worthless. And anybody that played it straight only to lose all their money when their bank went bust might break bad into the counterfeiting game simply to recoup some losses. If you can't beat them, This potential loss of value contingent on the success of a bank actually led some to believe that private banks were, in their own way, counterfeiters also. It's very sticky, and I'll leave that up to you. And to make matters even worse, catching counterfeits and their craftsmen required the cooperation of local law enforcement, which, if they even caught them at all, tended to be pretty lenient on offenders. As if the overwhelming prevalence of counterfeiting wasn't enough, the world also faced the Panic of 1857, the first global financial crisis and the first to spread rapidly throughout the United States. The Panic of 1857 was the culmination of a faltering global economy, an overextension of the US economy, and September 11th, 1857, when the SS Central America sunk, carrying the modern equivalent of $765 million worth of gold, depending on who you ask. The claims vary wildly, and they're dependent on the price of gold at the time, but it was enough to cause a problem. The ship was headed to New York City, and American banks on the East Coast were heavily depending on this gold to stay afloat, as Eastern banks had stopped accepting any form of paper currency to back their loans. As a result of this crisis, the US government was continuing to face a severe and chronic deficit. Now add to that deficit the loss of tax revenue from the recently seceded southern states, the need to finance the Civil War, and the federal government was floundering. and up to its ears in debt, taking out massive high-interest loans from domestic banks just in an attempt to cover their own bums and avoid going into debt with foreign countries. They had to do something, so they got to printing. As an emergency measure, 2 versions of paper money, or greenbacks, were put into circulation for the first time. The first were called demand notes. Between August 1861 and April 1862, Congress created and sent into circulation $50 million worth of these demand notes. These basically allowed the U.S. government to borrow against itself with the guarantee that these could be redeemed at a later date at the Treasury for gold coins. And the second one we're a little bit more familiar with, United States notes, or legal tender notes. These are the closer of the two to the current Federal Reserve note that we know and use today, but they're not the same. We won't go down that rabbit hole. So let's recap our conditions here. The Civil War is wrapping up. A variety of private banknotes are already in circulation with a crippling counterfeit problem. Federally issued greenbacks are in wide circulation for the first time, and the US has a population of innovative and potentially desperate people on the prowl for ways to fulfill their American dream. How are you going to fix this one? During the heyday of fake banknotes, the immediate economic consequences of counterfeiting fell mostly on private banks and individuals. Once the federal government issued their own currency, however, the problems of sovereignty and trust reared their ugly, beastly heads at the top of the American food chain. The Fed honchos were now much more aware of the importance of trust in currency, and were desperate to eradicate counterfeiting before the moneymakers drove the federal dollar to ruin. To combat counterfeiting and maintain trust in U.S. currency, Congress authorized a fund to be used to clamp down on the practice. But rather than brainstorming and figuring out how these funds should be spent, they just pretty much threw it onto the shoulders of the Department of the Treasury and told them to figure it out. In response, the Treasury Department, headed up by Treasury Secretary Hugh McCulloch at the time, proposed increasing federal policing powers and developing an anti-counterfeiting agency. And on April 14, 1865, on his Treasury Secretary's recommendation, Lincoln signed legislation creating the Secret Service. It would actually be the last piece of legislation that Lincoln ever signed. Less than 24 hours after signing in the existence of the Secret Service, Abraham Lincoln was dead. The freshly formed Secret Service set out on their anti-counterfeiting goal with no protective missions distracting them from that. In its first year and under its first chief, William Wood, the Secret Service closed over 200 counterfeiting plants. That's pretty staggering considering you couldn't just look these up or hop on a plane back then or call somebody up on a cell phone and be like, yo, go bust this dude. It's also important to note that the creation of a federal policing agency was actually a very big, scary step for the US government and for the United States in general. The Secret Service had an uphill battle when it came to building trust with people, as it was formed during a time where people were extremely distrustful of a centralized government. And the strongest loyalties were rooted locally, not really nationally. Never before had federal police exercised national authority over largely localized criminal operations. But that attitude did not slow them down. Through their success, the Secret Service actually helped people ease into the idea of increased federal power and authority. Now, this was not an explicit or even expected goal of the Secret Services, and it's not something that they intentionally set out to do, but it did soften people up to the idea of increased federal power. Now, I'm not really sure what to think about that, given that this was a long time ago. The situation was clearly very sticky and dynamic, and something needed to happen with counterfeits. Kind of a weird one, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts on it below. In their first 2 years, the Secret Service honed in on their anti-counterfeiting operations, but their to-do list got a big boost in 1867 when they were tasked with detecting persons perpetrating fraud against the US government. This put targets on the backs of more individuals in criminal operations, like the Ku Klux Klan, moonshiners, mail-in land fraudsters, and a number of others engaged in activities that were already in violation of federal laws. Over the coming decades, they would successfully chip away at counterfeiting, and even began going after more counterfeit coin operations starting in 1877. For some reason, it took Congress a whole 12 years after the formation of the Secret Service to make counterfeiting coins federally illegal. I'm not really sure what happened there, but moving on. By the end of the 20th century, the United States Secret Service still wasn't officially tasked with any protective missions. I say officially because there was an incident involving Grover Cleveland, his wife Frances, and 3 Secret Service agents. Not to mention a pretty embarrassing White House cover-up. I'm not getting into that in this video here, but if you want to check that out, you can check out the short that I recently posted about Grover Cleveland, the White House Secret Service cover-up, whatever I decided to title it. It's there. I promise. So now we're just inches past the end of the 20th century, and here comes another great American tragedy. And with that, an increased pressure on the federal government to do something about it. On September 6, 1901, the 25th President of the United States, William McKinley, was shot twice in the stomach by anarchist Leon Czolgosz. CZO. This was while McKinley was attending the Pan American Expo in Buffalo, New York. Though he was expected to recover, he died 8 days later of gangrene. They didn't really know where the bullet went. One guy thought it was like lodged in his back muscle or something. I don't know. I wasn't there. The public outcry and mourning in response to yet another presidential assassination was tremendous. While William McKinley wasn't exactly the most popular president, U.S. citizens were kinda tired of the presidents dropping dead like every few years. This was the third sitting U.S. president in 36 years to be assassinated while in office. If you were a U.S. president sometime during 1865 to 1901, you had a 1 in 3 chance of being assassinated while doing the job. Anybody could see, including the international community, that some serious rethinking was in order. While Congress was figuring out who should be protecting the president full time, the United States Secret Service took on the task in the interim, despite no legislative mandate. Some in Congress actually believed that the U.S. Army should be the ones that handled it. Can you imagine? But ultimately, in 1906, 5 years after William McKinley's assassination, Congress would hand down the legislative mandate to the United States Secret Service to protect the president around the clock. Today, the U.S. Secret Service is snuggled up deep under the Department of Homeland Security, having hopped from the Treasury Department in 2002. They're primarily tasked with protecting the president, vice president, their immediate families, former presidents, and any of their kids under the age of 16, visiting foreign heads of state and their spouses and presidential candidates. In addition to protecting this very exclusive club of very important people, they're also tasked with protecting some places, some being the White House, the vice president's residence, motorcades, and one that's been in the news more recently, foreign embassies and ambassadors' residences. And while this protective mission is their primary one, they're still tasked with investigative missions that include counterfeiting, cybercrime, financial crime, including cryptocurrency, and any fraud perpetrated against the United States government. Staffed with 7,700 employees across 16 different departments, roughly half of those are special agents, with the remainder split between administrative, technical, law enforcement, and uniformed division roles. There's been increasing scrutiny of the Secret Service's practices, operational holes, and even agent behavior in recent years, and much of it appears warranted. Like the time 2 Secret Service agents drunkenly drove over a suspicious package in 2015, or when a man carrying a gun rode in an elevator with Obama. There's even been recent news that Pence would not go with the Secret Service into a car on January 6th because he was worried that they would take him away from the Capitol. It's clear that even the vice president can have doubts of who the United States Secret Service is actually serving. And on top of that, there's been some serious accusations of political extremists infiltrating the ranks of the Secret Service in the past few years too. But while it's likely that most of us would agree that some serious reform is in order, at least somebody's doing the job, I think. Hey, thanks so much for watching. This is actually my first long-form video ever. And if you made it this far, it really does mean a lot. I hope you learned a bit and had fun doing it. If you have any thoughts, comments, or even ideas for things you'd like to see next, throw them down below. If you want to see what's next, hit that subscribe button to keep in touch. Thanks again, and until next time, keep curious.